Hello, and welcome to the Waves webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about compressors, limiters, and expanders, presented by Barry Wood, author of the book Waves Plugins Workshop, Mixing by the Bundle. But before we get started, I'm going to take a minute and go through the format of the webinar for anybody that hasn't done one of these before. My name is Yoni and I'm the moderator. You can't see me, but I'm here working behind the scenes to help make sure everything runs smoothly. The webinar will last about an hour and has two parts to it. The first half will be a presentation from Barry, where he'll walk us through the most common dynamics processing used in mixing, focusing on compressors, limiters, and expanders. The second half of the webinar will be an open Q&A. Feel free to submit any questions you have, and based on how much time there is, we'll try and answer as many of them as we can get to. You can send your questions in at any time, but you won't see them right away in the chat, as they'll first go to me, and then I'll feed them to Barry one at a time. Keep in mind that there are a lot of people online with us today, so we appreciate your patience while you wait to have your questions answered. I'm going to hand things over now to our presenter for today. He's the author of the book Waves Plugins Workshop, Mixing by the Bundle, which provides an informative overview of the Waves plugins used in mixing studios the world over. Each chapter covers a wide variety of plugins, including valuable tips and tricks that will enhance your productions and offer real-world, hands-on experience through downloadable audio files and plugin presets that let you actually hear the power of these tools. Today you're in for a treat as you're going to get an up-close look at the wealth of information presented in this book. So please welcome the author of Mixing by the Bundle, Barry Wood.
Hi, I'm Barry Wood, and I'll be presenting this webinar on Dynamics plugins. I've been a professional audio engineer for nearly 30 years and have mixed and mastered over 400 albums. I've been the technical editor on 7 different books about audio, and I'm also the author of Waves Plugin Workshop, Mixing by the Bundle. This is a book I wrote that I produced tracks for the book, and then each chapter I cover a more complete Waves bundle, and I take the same song, and the song evolves in its mix over the course of the book. The first half of each chapter discusses the plugins in the bundle, like starting with Musicians 2 bundle and Silver bundle, all the way up through the Mercury. But first half talks about the new plugins in that bundle, and the second half talks about the application in the mix. All the tracks are downloadable as well as all the presets, so you can actually follow along, bring them up, and check it out yourself. For this, and I'll be using the song that I produced for the book for this webinar as well. So today I'm focusing on Dynamics plugins, and since the book and the webinar really cover the nuts and bolts aspects of equalization or dynamics processing, I'm going to skip all the Artist Series plugins because they really abstract the process. There's some cool stuff in there, but they, it's not a great learning tool. Same thing with their one knob. I mean, those are kind of fun, but you're not going to learn a whole lot from me showing you one knob. Compressors, limiters, expanders, and gates. That kind of covers the range of the basic range of Dynamics plugins. And they're all about automatically reducing the volume in one way or the other. Technically, you can accomplish the same thing through tedious volume automation, but it's easier and quite a bit more fun to use these tools. There's 2 basic things that you use Dynamics processors for. To fix things, to smooth out uneven performances, tame peaks, and also to clean up audio by getting the noise eliminated between tracks with expanders and gates, or between phrases. And they can also be used creatively to bring out detail and to create a vibe. I mean, some of the compressors, you can really get some change the character of a track. Let me start off with covering the basic concepts behind these plugins, or actually these processes. So this graph shows the amplitude over time of an example signal. So going up to -0, which is full value samples, down to -60. You can see here the peaks are hitting between kind of -3 and maybe -12, and the noise floor is down here around -48. The first thing that you deal with is the threshold. The threshold determines what part of the audio signal the process is going to act on. For compressors and limiters, it's going to be the audio above the threshold. For expanders and gates, it'll be the audio below the threshold. With a compressor, you set a ratio. What that determines is for every decibel input, what the output is going to be. Now here's an example of what a 2-to-1 ratio would do to the signal. So you'll see right now you've got these peaks up here. If you put a 2-to-1 ratio, everything above the threshold is essentially going to be half as loud as it was before. So for every 2 dB of gain above the threshold, you'll get 1 dB of output. So you can see the whole thing pretty much scales down. If you go up to a 4-to-1 ratio, it gets even more, well, compressed. And you'll see that, like here, you've got some sort of lower level signal, and now it's much closer to what the peaks were. So, in this case, you're seeing it really kind of even out what's going on. Once you've compressed the signal, you can see it's overall quieter. So that's where makeup gain comes in. The makeup gain is just an overall boost after the compression happens. So here's showing that saved signal with makeup gain. So now you've got a pretty consistent signal happening. The peaks aren't sticking out. They're not kind of poking out of the mix. But you've also brought up your noise floor. So you have to be careful. When you really get into some heavy compression, it can cause the noise to become much more apparent. Now, a limiter is, well, in the old days, a compressor with a ratio of 10-to-1 or higher was considered a limiter. With digital processing, it's basically infinity to 1. You set the threshold, and the audio is not going to get any louder than that threshold. So here's an example of if you had this limiter set at -12 here, see it's going to catch these 5 peaks. The digital limiters actually look ahead. There's some delay that's introduced by the plugin, so it gets the audio early and then delivers the audio on time. That's part of the whole delay compensation that you'll find. So instead of just creating a flat top, which is clipping and would create distortion, it actually looks ahead a little bit and turns it down just as it's coming up. So you'd get results that look more like this. So you can see these peaks have just been quickly brought down to that threshold. When you're using compressors and limiters, your ear is the first thing that you want to use to be able to tell what's going on, what it's doing to the signal. But if you want to see how hard the processor is working, you want to look at the gain reduction, sometimes labeled attenuation or GR for gain reduction. And see, typically for a limiter, anything above the threshold is going to have an equivalent attenuation. You want to be careful on, especially with limiters, of hitting it too hard, or because they're really designed to catch the peaks, not to process continuously. When you have a plug-in with a VU type display, typically you'll have a selector that shows input, output, and gain reduction. Whenever I'm working with the device or a plug-in with a VU, a dynamics processor, I pretty much always leave it on gain reduction because that's what you'll really want to monitor. And the needle type displays have different ballistics. They react differently than the digital displays. So you just kind of need to get a feel for how much you want to use. Let's see. Let me move on to expanders. So an expander, same thing. You set the threshold, and the expander is going to be acting on the lower level, the quieter part of the signal. It'll leave what's above untouched, and the controls for expanders are sometimes expressed as ratios, like 2-to-1 or 1-to-2 technically. I've seen it both ways. Sometimes they're expressed in how many decibels of expansion you want to use, 6 dB, 12 dB. So this, if you had this set up with a 2-to-1 expansion ratio, everything below that threshold will get twice as quiet. So you see the noise floor here is at -48 after a 1-to-2 compression. You can see that noise floor is dropped. So expanders are useful tools for for trying to get rid of the noise without affecting the rest of the signal. Now, a more extreme example of expansion is gating. With a gate, you're going to completely cut off everything below the threshold. So typically you'll set a gate threshold much lower. You want to get it so that it's just above the noise floor, but it's not going to get rid of any usable audio. So with a gate like this, you'll end up with an output signal like that. It gets just chopped off in between. So it's completely clean in between. Let me switch over and we'll actually play around with the gate in this project. So in this project, the guitar solo was a real high gain amp, and there was a lot of noise, ground loop, pickup noise. It was pretty noticeable. I'll go ahead and play it within the track, and you can hear in between the phrases, even with the entire mix going, you'll hear that buzz going on. It's actually accentuated because some of the, I'm using Enigma to do some kind of phasing on there. But here, check it out. So you get that lovely phased ground loop noise. And when I solo the track, you can hear it's pretty substantial. So I'm going to bring up C1. The waves, the C1 plugins are kind of like Dynamics Lab. They've got C1 gate, there's C1 comp and sidechain, and there's provide an amazing amount of control and parameters that you don't find on a lot of plugins. If you really want to get into some serious compression that really understand how things are going, I would really suggest pulling up C1, and there's the C1 manual, the PDF, and there's also a setup guide that has a lot of example settings, and it does some pretty amazing stuff. So here I'll solo the guitar with this gate on. So you can see the attenuation here in between phrases, it just drops down to nothing. So it's completely cutting it out. You can still hear the noise while it's playing, but in the context of the mix, it's a lot better. Now let me play it with the mix. So it's not perfect, but it's a whole lot better. One of the things you'll find with Dynamics plugins often are attack and release controls. Those are also really important aspects of Dynamics plugins. In this case, I've got a pretty darn quick attack. So let me show you what it would like if I increase this attack, to say even 10 milliseconds. You'll hear it's going to lose the pick attack on the beginning of the phrases. So instead of that sharp attack, it kind of ramps in. And on a gate, the hold and release. Hold is once the signal goes below the threshold, that's how long it'll wait before it starts releasing. So with a gate, the hold and release are really important to try to get a natural sound. If they're too short, it sounds choppy and cut off. If they're too long, you get the noise longer before it starts falling off. Sometimes I find, even in a noise reduction situation like this, expanders often sound a little more natural because you don't get that complete chop of the signal. In this case, the bridge was pretty open. There was loops, an acoustic guitar, and the lead guitar. Not a lot going on. So I thought it sounded better getting, really cleaning it up. Ideally you want to record the guitar without that noise, but I actually went out of my way to get a noisy track for the book to show things like gating and expansion, as well as covering some of the waves like the Z noise and X noise plugins. Let me see. Let's get into some compression. So on this track, I've got, go to the verse. We've got, drums, bass, guitar, vocals, electric piano. Let me let you hear what it sounds like. The more I look and try hard to see, the more I need to be true to me. So everything's kind of sitting pretty well in there. On the electric piano, I've got I'm using one of the CLA 76 plugins, one of Wave's modeled plugins. Let me play it for you soloed without the compression. You can see it's not a real even performance. There's some parts that kind of stick out, and if I play it without the compression in the track, you can see how it kind of steps on the vocal a little bit. The more I look and try hard to see, the more I need. And it kind of comes and goes. So with the compression on there, it gets that track to really sit in there, just add the texture behind the vocal without obscuring any words or bringing the attention to the electric piano when the attention really should be on the vocal. The more I look and try hard to see, the more I need to be true to me. You can see when it's really digging in, it's getting about 7 dB worth of compression. And again, the attack and release are important here. I've got a really fast attack. I want it to just jump on it. The attack, for some instruments, some sounds, a fast attack is going to kind of make it dull and kind of lifeless. Often you want to set the attack kind of as slow as you can get away with so that you get the kind of the energy of it, but then it jumps on the, smooths it out. And the release, like in this case, it's got a fairly, let me solo this again, and then we can play around with the release. Like if I set a really fast release, or really slow release, as those notes hang out, the compressor is still compressing. It's taking a long time to recover. if I speed that all the way up, it just, as soon as it's really following the level of the signal as it's going. I think I opted for a fairly fast one in the mix. And it did a nice job. Pretty much with all the Waves model plugins, I tend to leave the analog off. For most of them, all it adds is a low-level kind of hiss and hum. Some people like that. I spent too many years trying to get rid of that kind of stuff. So I leave those off. There's a couple of exceptions that I'll cover as I go through here. And then here with the meter, you can see, gain reduction, input, output. So as I was saying, I leave the gain reduction on pretty much all the time when I want to see what a compressor is actually doing. Oh, and in the CLA 76, this is modeled off the 1176. You don't have variable control of the ratio. You can have 4-to-1, 8-to-1, 12-to-1, or 20-to-1. And I find these, some people look at them as, restrictions or constraints, and the way I look at it is, there's been hundreds of thousands, thousands of albums, great albums made with these that sound wonderful, and so obviously there's ways to use them and they sound great. Let me see. Let's take a look at the bass. And I'll go to this section here.
Running aground, my sails all in tatters, looking around.
Well, the bass is doing a pretty good job of holding down the bottom end, which is amazing because I played the bass on that and I'm a pretty mediocre bass player. It's not my primary instrument. What really helped this thing work is this API 2500 compressor. The API are some of my favorite, pretty much my favorite Waves modeled plugins. The EQs and the compressor just sound great. And the API plugins, where a lot of the other ones, the analog switch adds noise, low-level noise and hum. That's also the case with the API, except they modeled them accurately. The API gear is really clean, but in the API plugins, it actually the analog switch engages some of the nonlinear distortion, some of the nice harmonics generating distortion that the original hardware produces. So all the API stuff, I always use the analog switch on. So here's the bass. Here's the original bass. Actually, I've got a little bit of Kramer EQ on it, but here's without the compression. So as you can hear, not maybe the best bass technique in the world. And here's what it sounds like after I've got the 2500 going. Still doesn't sound wonderful, but in the context of the mix, it really works. You can, one of the things this is doing is it's kind of adding a little more growl to it. It's giving the bass a little more bite, and even though it doesn't sound like it when it's soloed, it actually, makes the bottom end more solid. So let me play that section with the compressor bypassed, and you can see how the bass kind of doesn't really anchor it. It kind of comes and goes.
Running aground, my sails all in tatters, looking around.
there's parts where it stuck out, parts where it wasn't really solid.
Running aground, my sails all in tatters, looking around, failing.
So much better now. And that's what you don't want to get too hung up on listening to tracks when they're soloed, because you make everything sound great when it's soloed. It's not going to work in a mix. It's all about getting all the pieces to work. In fact, over the course of the book, the bass was something I struggled with. Earlier chapters I tried, multiband compression, tried boosting this, cutting that, and by the time I got to the end, I had finally figured out how I wanted the bass, how the bass worked sitting in the track with all the other instruments. So let's look at the vocals. Let's see.
Running aground, my sails all in tatters, looking around, trying to find the answer.
Okay, the vocal. I'm using the CLA 76 on this, but actually there's the blue and the black. They were different revisions. The blue was an earlier revision of 1176, and they have slightly different characteristics. So one thing you'll find from really any manufacturer, any plug-in company that's going to model older analog gear, you're not going to find two pieces of gear that are going to sound exactly the same. So, it all depends on which units they modeled. They used Chris Lord Alge's personal arsenal of gear to model the CLA series of plugins. And with this vocal, let me bypass it and solo that vocal. And you can hear what the vocal sounds like. I've got a little bit of vocal rider on there, but it's actually not doing a whole lot. But here it is without the compression.
Running aground, my sails all in tatters, looking around.
And what I'm doing for the compression on this is I'm using the all button mode. Some engineers figured out, the original equipment engineer, the people who designed the 1176, really intended the ratio buttons to be selected one at a time. Well, somebody figured out if they just mashed all four buttons in, it did some, just crazy, crazy compression. And so to give this vocal a vibe, that's what what I did on this track.
Running aground, my sails all in tatters, looking around.
It adds a little bit of distortion. It just kind of, it made it work really well within the track. Here it is without it.
Running aground, my sails all in tatters, looking around.
Here it is with it.
Running aground, my sails all in tatters, looking around, trying to find the answer.
So it, just gave it a nice, gave it a cool vibe. You want to be careful with that. Like if you can see I've got a C4 following that. Now let me bypass it. Solo this, I'll bypass the EQ. And if you look at the PAS monitor there,
Running aground, my sails all in tatters.
there's a whole bunch of energy down here, down below, 30 hertz. It's just mud. It's unusable. It's not functional audio in this track case. So I'm followed up that crazy compression with the this high pass filter.
Running aground, my sails all in tatters.
So be careful when you go into the all button mode, because it can make it ugly and interesting at the same time. Okay, another concept. Let's check out the drums. So here's just the drums. So I've got various plugins going on here, but what I want to show you here is on the drum submix. I'm sending all the drums to the to an aux track and submixing them, and I've got the hybrid compressor on that track. So here's the drums without the compressor. And then with. So I was bypassing in and out while that was going. What I'm doing on that is using a really pretty cool trick. I think it was, they call it the New York drum trick. It's using a compressor. It's parallel compression. What you do on a traditional mixing board is you'd send a signal out to a compressor and bring it back on another channel and mix it with the original signal. In this case, there's an actual mix knob within the plugin. So I'm running 60% wet and 40% dry. If you do it, especially on a drum submix, if you run the whole thing through the compressor, you tend to get it kind of pumps, the drums kind of come up and down, and what I wanted was to give the drums a little more kind of energy, use the compressor to bring up the lower level parts of it, but I didn't want to really mess with the peaks. So doing the mix allows you to have a good, nice transient come through, but then you get a fuller, kind of thicker sound. I'll play it again. I'll kind of bypass every bar, and you can get a better idea of what it sounds like. So I'll start with it engaged. So you can hear the snare gets a little more body to it. Overall it's a bigger sound. So here's a section with some toms. That should show a pretty good example. And in this case, it's actually kind of, giving a little distortion, a little edge to the toms in that section, which there's a lot going on there. And let me play it with the rest of the track there. Yeah, and that actually kind of kept it underneath the guitar a little bit. Let me see. Okay. Get into some de-essing. De-essing is essentially compression where it's only a compressor. Typically, you have a signal going into the compressor, and that signal is fed to the detection circuit to figure out what the amplitude is to determine how much gain reduction is going on, and it also processes that same signal. A de-esser uses what's called a side chain. With a side chain, you actually split that signal so it goes into the processor and into the detector, but in the side chain signal you can actually change it. With the de-esser, what it's doing is it's cutting out, focusing it, kind of giving you just a band of what's going on, so that all you're feeding the detector is the sibilance. Right, so here's
The more I look and try hard to see.
here. Let me monitor. This is just the sidechain. So, like a de-esser plugin is going to have kind of that functionality built into it. So the only thing you heard when monitoring the sidechain was really that C, the S on the beginning of that word. Since that's being fed into the detector, that's the only thing the compressor is looking at to act on. So in this case, with the de-esser, it's going to only attenuate the signal when it hears those S's. And you fine-tune that with the type of filter and the frequency. And if I play this without the de-esser in there, you'll hear what it sounds like with that S. In fact, I'll play it with the mix.
The more I look and try hard to see.
It's not too bad, but it kind of jumps out with the de-esser in.
The more I look and try hard to see.
Just kind of pulls that S down, just automatically. Again, you could do this with an automated EQ, but it's a whole lot easier to get a de-esser set up. Same concept. You set the threshold, you watch for the attenuation, and you just get it so it's only acting on the portion of the signal that you want it to act on. Okay, let me show you some examples of limiting. In the bridge of the song, I've got 3 drum loops going. And I liked what all 3 of them were doing, but there were some problems with getting them to actually work together. So I've got the second one is the main one. I decided that was going to be the main kind of kick and snare going on. Then I mix it in with this one, which I used an EQ. I rolled off a lot of the bottom end so it wouldn't compete with it. And it worked pretty well. Then the third one, this bridge, I have that third loop come in halfway through, just to add some more rhythmic, variation to what's going on. And this one had a pretty strong snare. I mean, that was poking through, and I really wanted I liked the little stuff that was going on in between the snare more than, I wanted to hear all that little stuff that was going on, but I didn't want the 2 and 4 of the beat to get that much louder in the second half of the bridge. So what I did is put a limiter in there, and it only acts on really the what's happening above that. So you can see the attenuation here is pretty big, and it's just when that snare hits, it's turned down. So I can use the gain makeup to bring the whole thing up. So essentially, really, if I bypass back and forth, you'll hear that the snare stays at about the same level, but when it's engaged, because of the limiting and then the gain makeup, all the lower level stuff really fits in, really comes out more. So here it is without, and I'll just bypass back and forth. So it's a little subtle, but actually in the entire mix, you can hear that those little, the other percussion really comes out when this is engaged. And also this one, I've actually got an EQ happening before the limiter, because this had here it is with without any processing. This is the original track. So depending on what you're monitoring on, you may or may not hear that. You can see here in PAS, there's this huge low-level thing happening here down, like 20 hertz. Now, if I fed that entire thing to the limiter, that low frequency stuff is going to be causing the limiter to kick in, And when I was first playing it, you could see it was only really hitting on the peaks. Now it's kind of constant, and you can hear some distortion too, because you don't want to have a limiter. The limiter should just be catching peaks. As soon as you get it where the signal is staying over the threshold for any amount of time, you'll hear distortion because it's just going nuts. So that's why I put the EQ before the limiter to just hack off all that low end, and let the limiter was then able to just grab on to the peaks. Now limiting, limiting is great when you have just these sharp little peaks sticking out, like on this loop, other tracks. Another application of the limiting is on the in the mastering stage, or on the master bus. Which, there it is. And you've got L1, L2, L3, L316. And, for mixing, L1 seems fine to me. L2, L3, those you'll hear more differences in a mastering context. L316 does some, I don't use that unless I'm really if I'm doing some mastering, I really need to beat something into shape. L316 does a nice job on that. But one thing I haven't really covered much is multiband compression. With a multiband compressor, you've got really multiple compressors going on, and it's using crossovers to split the signal into different bands and then compress each band separately. In mixing, sometimes that can be handy. If you've got something that's the high end is consistent but the low end is way too dynamic, sometimes a multiband can let you really just compress the low frequencies and leave the high frequencies alone. Or if there's a particular mid frequency, you can kind of narrow it down. It's more of an extreme fix kind of thing. The same thing with mastering. I mean, you can use a multiband in mastering if you've got something that's just kind of all over the place. It can help kind of bring it into focus there. Coming up here toward the end, I'm going to start. Let me touch on some of the more unique dynamics processors that aren't specifically compressors, limiters, gates, expanders. But nonetheless are still operating on the frequency or the amplitude of a signal. We've got, the verse guitar track. So on that one, there's Waves has max volume and MV2, max volume 2, which are pretty interesting processors. They're kind of abstract. You don't have much control over them, but they do some pretty cool stuff. You can bring up the low level or the high level elements of the signal. So you can see there's probably some multiband, and there's stuff going on behind the scenes that like in this case it's fairly subtle, but I'm using it just to bring out a little more the pick in the guitar and a little more edge. So it's a little, you know, a little brighter with that in there. If I really boost it, you can hear. With a high level. So I think what the high level is doing is as you pull it down, it's kind of like what I was doing in the drum loop. It's using a limiter and it's pulling down the threshold as it's bringing up the makeup gain. So you can get some pretty interesting, changes in the tone of a track with these. Some of the other simpler, actually, just back to compression real quick. The Renaissance compressor is somewhere in between. It's got you have an attack and release, threshold, ratio, gain. So you have the typical controls here. And it sounds, this was really the first digital compressor that I liked at all back when they introduced this. But it's definitely it's a great little compressor. Then you've got some of the other ones, some of the more abstract ones, slightly abstract, like Renaissance Axe. It's kind of designed for instruments. You just have a threshold and attack. And you have the gain reduction there that you'd be watching. Sometimes that has a really nice, does a nice thing for a track. Another one, the Renaissance Vox, is another nice plug-in that has a compressor, and it's just a single control compressor, more compressor, less compressor. But it also has a gate, so you can, I actually use it a lot when I'm doing, backup vocals. I'll have a bunch of tracks, feed those to an aux track, and I'll go ahead and put Renvox on there to do a little compression, and then, typically with background vocals, you end up with a fair amount of accumulated noise in between phrases. So just dial the gate in, and it cleans it up and compresses it all in one. Another cool plugin that's really pretty different is the Trans X. I'm using that on one of the loop tracks. The Trans X operates just on the transients. Just brings out just the attacks, separate from the more constant portions of the sound. So with this engaged, you're hearing a little more of the that little kind of shaker noise. I mean, you can really boost it, and so it's jumping on just those tiny little peaks, and you can set the duration of the peaks. So you can have it work on just super short stuff or longer stuff. So and then you have a release how quickly it gets out of the way. There's often times when you want to just bring that out and not necessarily, like on drums, you could use this to bring out more stick, but not really affect the decay, like on a tom, and vice versa. You can kind of pull it down, and in that case, it's causing those attacks to be quieter than the rest of the signal, which is something you just couldn't do with a typical compressor. So it's a really interesting process that when you need it, it's gold. And I think that pretty much covers what I've got, what I wanted to go over in here. And we're going to take some questions. Thanks for tuning in, and hope I was able to show you some things you may not have known. Okay, I've got a question from Carlos asking, what's your best choice, EQ before compressor or compressor before EQ? And like when I was showing you the example of that loop with a limiter, that was a clear case where the EQ needed to go before the compressor. I needed to lop off the low end so that the limiter would be able to do what it needed to do. There's other times when I do it the other way around. Let me see, what did I do on the vocals on this tune? On this one, yeah, this was a little bit different, but yeah, a lot of times I'll do, if the overall vocal is pretty good, I'll go ahead and EQ it, or I'll compress it, and then I'll EQ it just to kind of sharpen up parts of it. But you know, I don't have a hard and fast rule. It's whatever sounds best. See, Dave in Brooklyn. When would you use the Renvox plugin on a lead vocal as opposed to the 1176 modelers that you showed earlier? You know, it comes down to the individual case. They both do a similar thing. Like in this case, I was using a particular feature, that all button mode on the 1176, that I couldn't have gotten out of Renvox. But as far as overall compression, I think during the book I started with Renvox and then I switched and talked about the differences. So it just kind of comes down to what sounds better in that particular situation. They're both very useful. Okay, Eric is asking, when do you leave 30 hertz and lower frequencies in? Do we actually hear it on some instruments? Any reason not to filter out across the master bus? When I do mastering, I'll usually start rolling off around, probably start rolling off around 30, so that by the time it gets down to 20, it's starting to pull stuff out overall. In mixing, that's one thing I do a lot of is any instrument that, I try to filter out the low end on anything that's just where the low end is unusable or where it's not appropriate. I don't obviously do it on bass or the kick drum or like one of those, the main loop I had in there. Anything that really needs to live in the bottom end there, I just let it go. But all the other tracks where you do need to, where it's not useful, I'll just cut it out. It just opens up more space in the mix. The key is setting it so that you're not cutting out anything that's useful. Ty is asking, in regards to the New York compression, when do you recommend using it? What type of tracks do you slam with the NYC comp? And what type of tracks do you avoid using it on? Are there other waves compressors you use for the NYC comp? So the parallel compression. In this case, I was using it in a pretty subtle fashion. And really in a subtle, I wouldn't use it on a jazz album. Maybe blues, rock, pretty much any rock's album. A little bit of that can help out. Going crazy with it is, kind of style specific. I mean, it really can be a cool thing. Like if I really slam it on this. Well, actually this one I'm hitting pretty hard. See, there's just the compressed signal, which is pretty over the top. But if you mix it down, And there's actually, to do this same thing with other Waves compressors, I don't think there's any other compressors that have a mix. Maybe the hybrid, no, no, that's the new hybrid EQ. Yeah, so you'd have to kind of bus it and do it kind of manually. So this is really the, when I need to do that, I pretty much grab the hybrid comp. Nuno is asking, in the vocals, would you consider chaining a couple of compressors, doing slight compressions instead of slamming one? Absolutely. Different compressors act differently, and if you really need to get a lot of compression, you can get great results by putting two compressors in series that are either acting like say like an LA2A and 1176. 1176 is better at kind of grabbing those transients, and the LA2A is a better at kind of leveling. So I would maybe put an 1176 and then an LA2A, or just other compressors. If you find that to get the amount of compression that you need to get the track to sit, and it's sounding too compressed, that's when I would go for another compressor. Maybe try a different plug-in, and then backing them off and trying to get it in there. So that can quite often work. Usually when I track, I'll go ahead and track with a little bit of compression, like a nice outboard tube compressor. Just do a few dB of compression when I'm tracking, and then so typically I only need one compressor when I mix. David is asking, could you tell us what attack and release settings are recommended on vocal compressor, preferably on a slow vocal ballad? I don't think there's any real set rules for that. On a ballad, you're going to have a more exposed vocal track, so what you're doing is going to be really apparent. So you really need to set the attack so it's fast enough to start doing the compression, but not so quickly it's cutting off the the signature transients. And the release, the same thing. You want it fast enough that it's going to bring up like the tail end of phrases. If it's too slow, that you'll lose those. If it's too fast, it sounds a little unnatural. So you want to get it to just kind of ride with the phrasing of the singer, and get the whole thing a little more even and more present. Peter is asking, can you explain the difference and advantages between using a compressor for vocal track and Waves Vocal Writer? Yeah, that's a good one. The Vocal Writer is a really cool plugin. It's it looks at the input level of the vocal and just compensates for it. So it's like doing automatic writing with a fader. And if you just want to even out the performance, Vocal Writer is a winner there. All compressors can change the character of the vocal. If you want it to sound more aggressive, that Vocal Writer really isn't the one to do that. But using something like the 1176 or some of these other plugins, you can create a different character in the vocal with the compression. That's using it more as to change the quality of it rather than just smooth it out. Steve B, I see a Chapman stick behind you. What compression limiting approach do you find successful for a stick? Stick is tricky. It's being a tapping instrument. It got a lot of transients. I found like the 1176, either the real unit or the model units, does a pretty good job of really jumping on those and getting a more even sound if you're not the most consistent stick player. James is asking, what is the best all-around compressor for you? God, that's a hard one. If I had to just pick one compressor and live with it, probably, I don't know, the Renaissance compressor. I use that for so long. I know that I can get pretty much anything. it covers a real wide range. As far as the compressor I have the most fun with, maybe the API. That just does, creates a really cool sound, especially for drums. But you get around the bass, it did some really nice stuff with that. It's hard to pick just one though. Pascal, what is the technical difference between a compressor and a limiter? A compressor will start acting on a signal once it exceeds a threshold. A limiter will keep the signal below that threshold. In analog gear, a compressor with a processor with a ratio of 10 to 1 or more is considered a limiter because it's really doing it, but an analog device isn't going to keep that just absolutely below that threshold. Brett, what influences your decision to use different compressors on different sources? RenComp versus VComp versus API. It's just the tone. I mean, and a lot of it has to do with just really playing with these. Sometimes, my initial, instinct for a particular compressor doesn't work, and I swap it out, try a different one. And the best thing I can say is just really get familiar with the tools, try them out a lot. There's, VComp does some really nice stuff. In fact, I actually use that on the on this track. I used that on the top of the snare. In fact, let me check that out. So here's bypass. So, like here, the V-comp is giving it kind of a nice splat that made it stand up in the mix a little bit better. So really just use them, get a feel for them. Try not to do things too much by rote, because then you get into a rut and you don't find these cool accidents that turn out to create great sounding tracks. Keith is asking, is it good to record vocals with a compressor for volume? I tend to record vocals with a little bit of compression, like I was saying, with a little bit of maybe tube compressor or whatever you've got. But don't go nuts when you're recording, when you're tracking, because you got to live with it. I usually end up with maybe 3 or 4 dB of light compression, and I record everything 24-bit, so there's not much reason to have to record hot. I kind of still have that that habit from the old analog days, but a little bit of compression will also help in case the singer gets real loud and you don't want to clip. But yeah, just be a little moderate with the compression when you're recording. Slasha is asking, what's a good roll-off frequency for vocals? Again, it depends on the vocalist. Typically, that's where I'll solo a track. I have the high pass filter in there, and I'll just dial up the frequency until you can keep moving it up until you hear it start cutting out. Obviously, where you can hear it losing low end, and then you back it off. So then at that point, you're just cutting out the stuff that you don't need. In the context of the mix, you might decide you need to cut off a little more bottom end of the singer, depending on the track and the singer. But I'll usually start with, and that's the same thing for any track where where there's some low frequency junk in there. Just dial it up until it's, till you can hear it, and then back it off a little bit, and it's a good place. Jerry, I tend to use gain makeup knob as a second volume knob. Am I wrong doing this? Not at all. That's perfectly fine. Some of the modeling plugins, I think the gain, if you do more gain makeup, it may actually introduce some distortion, sometimes pleasant distortion. You want to be careful there. But like when I did this book, I didn't do anything as far as volume fader changes or automation or anything. So as I was changing plugins, I often use the gain makeup really as a volume knob. So that way I didn't have to, each chapter say, okay, now this fader's at, plus 1.2 dB. So I just, within the presets for each plugin, you could load it up, and and so I was really using the gain makeup to keep the volume where I wanted it after the processing. Jerry, do you have any preferences as to which instruments use the API compressors on? They sound brilliant on drums and percussion. That's kind of my first inclination. Particularly the API EQs as well. The compressor, well, in this case, I use it on the bass, and it did a great thing on the bass. So definitely bass and drums, but I'm not opposed to trying it on really any track. Alejandro, I heard the term compressor/sustainer in compression guitar pedals. What is a sustainer? As far as I know, I think a sustainer is really just a synonym for a compressor. It's maybe because compressors can act, with a fast attack, can act on peaks. You can also have a slow release and create a longer, more consistent tone. So I think sustainer is just another term really for compression. Just guitar players know what sustain is, so that's probably why they call it sustainer. Ian, what about bass rider? Would you use it? Yeah, I would use it. In fact, when I was, I didn't cover it in the book here because the book was Waves 8.0, and I had a copy of it in beta. And in this, for this kind of crappy bass track, bass rider didn't really help much. And I haven't gone back because they did make some changes to that before they released it. So I don't know. So I haven't gone back to see whether it would help on this track or not. But this one, it didn't help. But I've used it on other albums, and it does some nice stuff. Because bass is something I do end up doing a lot of volume automation by hand. So that's where the bass rider would really be able to replace that in a lot of instances. John, any tricks or suggestions for compressing heavy hard rock guitars for a more modern in-your-face approach? The real high gain modern metal type guitar sounds. Compressors are almost redundant on that because the amp is doing so much. The amp is, you look at the volume output and it's, got almost no dynamics left in it. So a compressor, if I do compress a distorted guitar, it's using a compressor that's going to also maybe generate some harmonics, change the vibe a little bit. So I don't know that compression really is going to do a lot for that. That's more about EQ and placement in the mix, and whether the tracks are doubled, how tightly they're doubled. A lot of that stuff is recorded. You can get more of that in your face recording direct through, like a Sans amp, or using an amp modeler without the cabinet modeler. So you just get that real tight, right in your face sound. So that's not so much a compression issue that I found. Sergio, is there any difference between using RVox or R channel with RVox, RenVox in between, within? Yeah, actually in this tune, in the final mix, I ended up using the Renaissance channel on the verse vocal, and you can either use the RenComp or the RenVox compression within that. And as far as I can tell, the sound of RenComp within the Ren channel is the same. And I think between Ren, yeah, it's to my ears it sounds pretty much like the same compressor. Joseph, how do you know when you've overcompressed or squashed the signal or the mix? How much is too much? Depends on what genre you're talking about, but generally that when you've done too much compression, you end up with something that's kind of lifeless. I mean, there's no dynamics, nothing kind of poking through. It's all just a homogeneous mess. So, what I would suggest is maybe when you think you may have done too much, try bypassing some compressors, play it, see how it feels to you. And because the tendency is to try to make it sound like a finished product when you're mixing, but that often results in too much compression. You want to leave something for the mastering stage. And I think it's important. A lot of people go ahead and throw stuff on the master fader in their mix. I find that it's important, even if you're going to master it yourself, do a 24-bit bounce without really anything on the master fader as far as dynamics go. You might want to put a limiter on there while you're mixing just to see what it sounds like to have those peaks knocked down. But go ahead and bounce down a 24-bit mix without the master fader, without compression and EQ on that. If for anything, to have an archive for remastering down the road. And then actually bring it in and do a mastering stage separately. Give yourself a little bit of a break, and then it'll help you hear it a little bit better. Okay, and we're going to take one more question from Steve. Which Waves plugin would you recommend for master bus compression? Using a single band, well, yeah, that's compression on the master fader is that's pretty tricky. With I would, well, the probably the Waves, the 2500, depending on what, I guess it kind of depends on what kind of tone you're going for ultimately. Yeah, I don't know, that's kind of another webinar, getting into mastering, because there's a lot more to it than just which compressor. It's where you put it, and that's much more signal dependent. So, and oh, somebody asked, awesome t-shirt, where you can get that. I think I got this at $6tees.com. So we're wrapping up here. Thanks for tuning in and all the questions. There were some great questions. My website's otherroom.com. I have information on the book, and actually all the tracks that we're playing here and the presets you can download from wavesbook.otherroom.com. There's links there to buy the book at various places, including I think Waves website. And thanks again.
That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you, Barry, and thank you all for taking part. We hope you enjoyed it. If you're interested in more information about the interactive book Waves Plugins Workshop, Mixing by the Bundle, please visit